Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. This is one of over 1,000 programs we've done since the pandemic began, and we are now having live audiences, but we also still do live stream, and we have Sam Wasson with us live stream, so that you can hear about his great new book, The Path to Paradise, a Francis Ford Coppola story. It's a fascinating combination of biography of him and movie analysis and also about Zoetrope, his creation. So first, way too many good stories to get into 1 hour, but we'll see how many we can get into. So the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about was, I got the impression from your approach that you kind of look at Francis Ford Coppola as an artist, more than as a movie director, trying to achieve something artistically that is not often done, and not often what drives movies. I mean, some small movies, yes. But here is a man, a director, and a writer, who's been associated with some of the absolute best movies in the last 50 years, and lots of them, not just a couple, and then lots of other artistic movies that were quite different and still showed a tremendous artistic ability, but missing that's going to be a big hit, kind of movie. So what do you think? It sounds from your book like he was making the big movies just to be able to fund the other ones. So is that your impression?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, he always wanted to make what he called small personal movies, but of course, he ended up making big personal movies as well. I mean, The Godfather, most famously, Apocalypse is a big personal movie, and then he also has The Conversation, which is a small personal movie. So he didn't stay true to that original ambition, not because he betrayed himself, but because Francis's imagination and collaborative instinct is so giant and improvisational that projects have a tendency to start manageable and then become enormous. And that's another facet of the way he makes movies, which is not the typical way. Movies, as we all know, are so expensive and require so much organization and management. It's very hard to make it up as you go along. You stick to a script, and that very much has to be your program for some very, very good, important reasons. Well, Francis discovers the movie as he makes it, as most artists discover their work as they go along. And that's part of what gets Francis into so much trouble, is because he wants to work on film the way that most artists get to work on their projects. And by the nature of the medium, they are allowed to do it. But in filmmaking, it's so much harder to self-discover as you go along, especially when you're working with hundreds of other people. So that's partly why this question of why the small becomes big in Francis's case tends to always happen. And of course, when it becomes unmanageably big, it could explode. And it has, in Francis's case, exploded many times.
Let's go back to a little bit of the stories about his childhood. But before we do that, the story that you wrote, you included that he had written himself about a king meeting the God King. Why don't you explain, because it's an image he had of himself, obviously, in high school, right? Didn't you write it in high school or something?
Yeah, I think he was 15 or 16. He wrote a story called King God. And this is basically a story about a man who has notes for God. He has some feedback.
Yeah.
He wants to run the show himself. And it's not out of arrogance, which is a very important point about Francis that people get wrong. They think that Francis and many film directors are in it for the power rush. No, Francis is in it because he has a good idea. And this story, King God, is about a fellow who has a better idea, you know, and we all have a better idea. None of us are happy with suffering. None of us are happy with poverty. We all look up to God and we say, is this really the best you can do? Um, and and that's Francis's story, and he fights that fight through movies, and very few people do. You know, even our best filmmakers, they don't look at the enterprise of making movies as a way to make the world better, as cliche as that sounds. They really are artists, full stop. But Francis is an artist, and a humanitarian, and a utopian. And that's part of why he's in a war with God, and always has been since he was a boy, which is another thing that's remarkable about that.
Yeah,
that
he,
story.
he, he didn't wait to grow up first before
No,
he got in an
no, he
argument.
always
No.
was. Yeah.
Well, I want to mention that your book, The Path to Paradise, is one of our Good Lit events that's underwritten by the Bernard Osher Foundation here at the Commonwealth Club, which is a nice honor also for your book. So the the thing that struck me was I did not think this was his story. I was always his movies I know, and I've written about, read about him and stuff like that. I haven't written about him. But I didn't realize what kind of a childhood he had. You know, some say like he identified with a poor child, but he didn't really have a poor childhood.
No.
But in general, just the way he went about doing that. The reason the identification with the poor was you mentioned this story about how he identified with the poor boy not being able to get the rich girl. And and that should be part of that should be part of the images. So he has a lot of images in his mind that don't even match his life. So and it's also like
metaphor.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
It's also so fascinating that he had so much trouble, even working on The Godfather. It almost got taken away from him, and you think, how could that have happened? This was this was meant to be, so to speak, But anyway, let's talk about that. You talk about the metaphor now, and we'll get to that.
Oh no, well, it's a metaphor for a deficiency in himself that he believes is in himself.
Yeah.
And in a lifetime of writing the biographies of artists, I keep finding again and again, and I'm writing about Frank Capra now, and I'm in his childhood, and I've found it again to be true, that it does begin with a perceived deficiency that the artist has, and that creates an energy to imagine, a daydream world in which the question is asked, what if I were better? And that becomes the engine for creation. So Francis, perceived himself as poor or impoverished in many ways as a child, and that became the fuel for his utopian vision and creativity.
Tell about what the source of it was. I mean, he had polio, right? So
it was many things.
Yeah.
Polio was unfortunately only one of the afflictions that Francis suffered. He was aware of himself as the ugly duckling of the family. His brother, August Coppola, who incidentally is Nicolas Cage's father. August Coppola was movie star, beautiful, striking, the older brother, capable with girls. So Francis took a hit there, and also growing up with two narcissistic parents the way that he did, there is going to be just a natural feeling of self-blame and self-loathing. So Francis had a lot of reasons to not think so highly of himself.
And you're saying that you've discovered with other artists as well, that this kind of sometimes creates a utopian impulse. And his attempt to create a studio that did things in a different way was also an attempt at creating a utopia.
Well, it doesn't create a utopian impulse in every artist,
Hmm.
but it does create the will to want to make yourself more appealing to the world.
Hmm.
More appealing to the world than you perceive yourself. And it's why a lot of people with very low self-esteem go into show business,
Hmm.
for instance. Um, for all of the beauty and the talent that we perceive, in fact, it really does begin with I'm not good enough.
Hmm.
But Francis was early on um, cued into how can I make the world better. Um, and you know, it's not true of Martin Scorsese, for instance,
Hmm.
who also grew up with affliction. But Francis, for whatever reason, well, I do know the reason actually. It's because he wanted to hang out with people.
Hmm.
When he was a boy, he was socially ostracized. It's not just the self-loathing. Um, he he was isolated as a child with polio um, and spent a lot of time at that window thinking, I want to be with people. I want to be having a good time with people. And so utopia is a world in which people can be together happily.
Hmm.
And that started with Francis in his polio bed, um, looking out the window. I want to be there, you know.
Well, he certainly was in the room where it happened. I mean,
Yeah.
if you say, uh, the, one of the things that struck me about your story was how all of this talent was in the same place. It reminded me of Bloomsbury, for example, for a writer,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Just say the names of the people in his group, where did they met at the film schools in LA? Is that?
Yeah, it was they met at well, they came from USC and UCLA film schools. We're talking about famously George Lucas, like Coppola's younger brother. And these people had no success at this point. I mean, this really was fresh out of film school. Um, a great director, Carol Ballard, who would go on to direct The Black Stallion for Francis.
Mhm.
Walter Murch, visionary sound designer who did the sound for Godfather, Apocalypse, Conversation. Um, the director of photography, Caleb Deschanel. Um, um, just loads of people. Fred Roos, who we just lost, one of the great casting directors of all time. It really was Bloomsbury. It was a golden era
Hmm.
for film creativity in Hollywood, and the reason for that is this was the first generation of people to have grown up on the movies.
Hmm.
Um,
It's funny to
Go
think
ahead,
of, it's
Yeah.
funny to think of them as all 22 or 23 years old.
Yes, yes.
And what you make clear is how young they were when they succeeded as a
Yes.
director of these movies. I mean, I don't know, how old was George Lucas for his first big hit? I mean, they seem to be in their 20s for their first movie.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, George was directing THX 1138 for Francis before Star Wars. That must have been in 1971. So I don't remember when George was born, but that's definitely puts him in his early 30s, I would think.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was a period when when the old Hollywood was failing,
Mhm.
and people, it was the 60s. Hollywood didn't know how to reach the new audience, and a new generation was coming up at just that moment. The stunning smash success of Easy Rider
Hmm.
in 1969 um, gave Hollywood a roadmap. Hey, wait a second, we could be making these cheap little movies. I mean, I think Easy Rider cost $1 million,
Yeah.
and it made hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's a very good business model. Um, and because Easy Rider was made by a bunch of crazy people who went out on the road and, basically got high and did whatever they wanted, it set a very healthy creative precedent for the rest of the industry
Mhm.
in terms of freedom,
Right.
in terms of in terms of executives turning it over to the artists, the crazy people, and saying, hey, wait a second. you can make art and we can make money. Everyone's happy. And for a few good years in Hollywood, it really worked.
It's interesting that that period of time had a lot of that, because there's Andy Warhol with in the art scene, but then also a lot of the music that was being created by
Yep.
people who are pretty crazy in their personal lives and just making it up as they go along, so to speak, and even a few
Well,
writers
and also
too. Yeah.
the corporate monster had not yet settled over Hollywood.
Hmm.
Um, and so good things were possible.
Hmm.
It's less so today. It, but then there was money and there was freedom, and that's what anyone needs to do a good job to create, no matter what their field is.
Well, in Coppola's case, he definitely ended up with the money and the freedom, and then the money went, and then he had his freedom
Yeah.
even more, and then he did it again. So how did he get his first big break? Was being the screenwriter for Patton, right? I mean, he did some other smaller things before that, but how did
That was a
how did he
biggie.
get picked to be the screenwriter for Patton? He must have already had some kind of track record.
Coppola was the first of his generation to get famous as a young filmmaker. This is before Spielberg, before Lucas, before Scorsese.
Mhm.
Coppola, and also as a great self-promoter and colorful character in his own right.
Mhm.
He got a lot of press coverage in the mid 60s when he graduated USC. He won a big scholarship prize and made a lot of noise going out to New York to finance his own first movie called You're a Big Boy Now. And this made great copy.
Hmm.
This kid going out and making a movie
Mhm.
outside of Hollywood, we take that for granted now, but it was a story then. So based on the success and noise around You're a Big Boy Now, he got an agent. The agent got him Patton,
Mhm.
the job of writing Patton. But Patton, hit a bunch of roadblocks and a bunch of rewrites. And
Mhm.
it was Burt Lancaster at first, and Burt Lancaster didn't like Francis's script, so Francis was out, and then Lancaster dropped out. So years go by before George C. Scott finally gets aboard. But by then, Francis has already taken off on this great independent adventure. He didn't wait for success.
Mhm.
Francis is I guess what I'm saying. Success found Francis when he was already flying.
Mhm.
And by that point, he had started Zoetrope in San Francisco, which was the seed of this utopian idea that he was going to pursue for the rest of his life. And
And one of his
in the
partners was George Lucas
and one of his partners was George Lucas, and they all
before
went
Star Wars.
before Star Wars. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
The way they met is very interesting, and Francis was in Hollywood, um, making a film of Finian's Rainbow at Warner Brothers, and Lucas happened to have his own scholarship, and he was visiting the set, and that's just how they met. They like to say they were the only two guys with beards at the studio, which tells you something about that era.
Yeah.
And what this story's about.
Yeah. And so, well, they thought the only thing they could do with those beards is create a commune north of San
Yes.
Francisco, but one that was designed to make films.
That's right. It all comes out of that communal spirit of happenings in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And San Francisco is obviously a huge part of that. These guys picked San Francisco very, very specifically. It wasn't just to get away from Hollywood. It was to go to San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. All right. So he did the screenplay for Patton, and that doesn't sound like something that would follow You're a Big Boy Now, but there it is, and of course it's extremely well written movie and has been considered that for a long time. But it got produced and created 2 or 3 or 4 years after he had written it, right? And at that time, what I love the story was he'd already been hired to be the director of The Godfather, which of course you kind of think of that he was the one that created that whole thing. He's so connected to the Godfather that it seems like it was all his plan, but it wasn't his plan. It was somebody else's plan that he kind of resisted, right? That's what your book says. Yeah. Tell that story.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
It's very interesting and very important. And this is why I think a lot of biographers have gotten Francis wrong. And partly why I felt that there needed to be a new book about him. Francis did not want to direct The Godfather. Now that tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah.
He did not want to direct this big studio movie based upon a soap opera novel, kind of work a melodrama, The Godfather. And it was George Lucas who said to him, Francis, we need the money. We.
Yeah. So you do that.
Yeah.
Because we need the money, so you do that.
So you do that. And that's why Francis said yes. This is important. He didn't say yes because he wanted to direct The Godfather because Francis is an Italian and a family man, which we all know. No, he directed The Godfather for money so he could support his utopian enterprise. And in the course of directing The Godfather, he fell in love with it. He changed it. And this is what I was talking about. Francis is the improviser, discovering a work as it goes along. The Godfather takes shape as Francis is making it, and that's how he falls in love with it. And that's how it goes from being a impersonal studio movie, a job, in other words, to a work of art that is as personal to him as anything.
So he's doing The Godfather. He's directing The Godfather. He's been hired on to what is not his project, and almost exactly what he didn't want to do, but talked into it by George Lucas. And he's having trouble because he's fighting with the studio. And then he wins his Oscar for the screenwriting for Patton. And for some reason, they then stopped arguing with him.
Yeah. No, it's a good thing for your career to win an Oscar. If you have a choice, definitely choose winning the Oscar. It'll help in incredible ways. Yes. Francis, I love the story in the book. Francis was in New York watching the Oscars with his buddy, Marty Scorsese. Scorsese said to Francis, I think the studio's going to lay off you now. And they didn't really, but it gave Francis the confidence he needed, and to not only make the decisions, but also to understand Michael in an emotional and immediate way. When Francis makes movies, he becomes the story, like a method actor lives the part. Francis is always looking, and it's not always conscious. He's always inserting himself into the fiction so he can live it, understand it, and winning that award allowed him to step into Michael's shoes a little bit more, grow into his power as the Godfather, as the one who is controlling this movie. A very important point, I thought, for Francis's emotional and artistic development.
You also kind of hint, I don't know how directly you said it, but that before that point, he identified maybe a little bit more with Fredo than he did with Michael.
Yes, exactly.
That's so interesting.
Yes.
Go ahead, talk about that, because this is fascinating, because Fredo's, Fredo.
Fredo's the loser.
Yeah.
But that's who Francis was in his mind. That's the polio kid who can't get the girl, who's the middle child and the younger brother to the great star, August Coppola. I mean, Francis is in his heart a version of that. He's never gonna betray the family like Fredo, but it's that loser fear in him that is Fredo. Definitely, definitely.
All right, so he finishes The Godfather, and of course they start talking to him about doing Godfather Part 2 right away, probably. But he has this Apocalypse Now project, which came out of his group from long ago, right at the beginning.
Yes.
Why don't you explain that too? Because that took a long time to make, and it's very interesting how there's so many projects in this group created by other people that he then takes over, and yeah.
That's the collaborative, that's part of the utopian, creative, collaborative, social ideal behind Zoetrope. But before I talk about Apocalypse, I'll say briefly about Godfather 2. You know, again, he doesn't want to direct Godfather 2. The reason he says yes is because they allow him to make the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more in line with his utopia, zoetrope idea of filmmaking.
It's interesting that Gene Hackman seems so perfect for this role, but he was pretty far down the list of people that he was looking to play that role, right? And lots of people turned it down.
Well, it started out, Coppola wanted Brando, but everybody wants Brando for everything, especially if you're, that age.
Yeah.
Coppola grew up on the Kazan pictures, so of course he'd want Brando.
Right.
Yeah, a visionary piece of casting, I think, to put Hackman in that movie. It's not an automatic choice,
right?
But looking back on it, it's so perfect you can't imagine anyone else doing it.
Was that one of the things you mentioned that Fred Roos, I think, was the casting guy?
Yeah, Fred Roos.
Is he the one that picked him out, or do you maybe?
I don't know if it would have been something that everybody talked about together. But Francis is just as great at casting as anyone. I mean, let's remember Pacino had only made one movie when Francis put him in The Godfather. Marlon Brando was a headache that nobody wanted to deal with. Francis had to, bring all of this home. And Roos was a major figure. To cast Star Wars with those unknowns, to cast American Graffiti, also a Zoetrope movie, with those unknowns, that's a real measure of Roos's vision, that he picked those people out from nothing. But I'm digressing.
That's right.
We were on Apocalypse.
I thought the same thing. This is a total distraction from Coppola, but the people who picked out the 3 kids for Harry Potter, and then and then went through 8 movies, and all 3 of them were like unbelievably perfect for the role.
Absolutely.
I hope that she got $1 billion for that, or whoever did it.
Yeah. I hope so too. I mean, it's one thing to say, we should have Marlon Brando in this. That doesn't take a genius.
Right.
To say we should have the greatest actor of all time. But to say we should have this person who is unproven, who's going to be the center of a multi-million-dollar gamble, that takes real vision and persuasion. Roos had it, and Francis has it, absolutely, and real courage to stand by that when the studio is pressuring you to go the other way. And you have a feeling about this person. But that's Francis. He bets on his feelings.
Yeah, and obviously with his track record, he has so many hits and so many misses. But Babe Ruth did too.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's exactly right.
So the craziness of Apocalypse Now. I mean, lots of people know about the craziness of Apocalypse Now, and you have really a lot of good information about it. But it sounds like they talked themselves into their own insanity and filmed it, in a way, and not knowing what the ending was going to be. And just tell everybody about the
right. Well, Francis, as I mentioned a little before, Francis creates a world to make a movie. When when he was promoting Apocalypse at Cannes, he would say, "We created a war to film a war."
Hmm.
And that's how he works on Godfather. He created a family to film a family.
Hmm.
You know, he would talk about how The Godfather is the most expensive home movie ever made. Um, and this is why Francis is so unruly and why Hollywood's is so afraid of him. Because he's world building.
Hmm.
And that's again part of his utopian muscle. He wants to make a movie about Vietnam. Well, he's going to create madness. And in the process, he will himself go mad.
Hmm. Yeah, sounded
And
like it. And
he did.
yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting is that one of the original images thought up by whoever did the original idea, one of the guys in the original group of people. Sorry, I don't know the name off the top of my head, but one of his original scenes was this colonel who gets the other guys to go surfing in the middle of a war, which is an unbelievably, iconic scene. So he clearly had that element of it from the original idea. How many years later? 15 years later, before the movie was
Right. Yeah. I mean,
15
they
years
were
later.
right. They started throwing this thing around in film school. So it was right at the beginning of the war,
Mm-hmm.
65, 66. Um, uh, and the fellow who you're talking about is John Milius,
Uh-huh.
who is also part of the Zoetrope group. And Milius is a big surfer.
Mm-hmm.
And um, he thought of this as an LA war, a rock and roll war. And rock and roll was in LA, and that at that time. So, that's only a short step away from we're gonna surf, Charlie Don't Surf.
Yeah.
And we're gonna blast rock and roll. And that's and these are kids going off to war, dying. So rock and roll and surfing brings all that out. And that was a kernel, like you were saying, that was a creative um, touch point for what became Apocalypse and what stayed with Apocalypse. This story, like you say, that took 10 years before Francis even rolled camera on it.
And it was. Do we know who took the Heart of Darkness from Joseph Conrad's book and put that into the story? Because I don't think that was there at the start, right?
No, the Heart of Darkness wasn't there at the start. There's some debate. Um, Carol Ballard, hanging out in that group, had himself wanted to do Heart of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Francis who said, "Hey, wait a second, we're going up the river here." The metaphor for Francis was very clear. And Francis is always thinking of myth and metaphor, and always thinking of literature, and reveres novelists to the degree that he'll always put the novelist's name above the movie title.
Mm-hmm.
Mario Puzo's Godfather, Bram Stoker's Dracula, S.C. Hinton's Outsiders, John Grisham's The Rain People. So Francis is always thinking of writing and writers.
All right. So they're out and they didn't film this one on a lot, Apocalypse. They filmed it in the middle of the jungle in the Philippines.
That's right. That's right.
They built villages.
The world.
That whole ending that goes on for a while with Brando and the playing Kurtz, which is the main character in The Heart of Darkness, too, losing his mind. Yeah, in your writing about it, you kind of said that's kind of like a necessary element for civilization or something to not go mad, but to accept the death ritual, the whole myth, death ritual, that kind of it. Yeah, I'm not saying that you personally, but that Francis Ford Coppola was interested in that part of civilization and presenting it as it was, especially in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and what we did in Cambodia and everything. It perfectly fit. So,
Yeah, he took that from Frasier, The Golden Bough,
mhm.
um, and the story of how, how a king, to be strong, has to be the master of his own demise.
Mhm.
He has to be part of of his own death, his own succession. And so and at the same time, he has to choose, his successor has to be the one who he recognizes as willing to destroy him.
Mhm.
So it's a collaboration between the generations, um, ideally. And that's what Francis wanted to dramatize in The Death of Kurtz, The Slaughter of Kurtz by Willard,
Mhm.
which he cross cuts with The Slaughter of the Bull,
Mhm.
also a ritualistic um, um, rite of passage, ritual. It's a rite of passage. Um, so I don't know whether he succeeds in the movie. I think it's more of an idea that's more appealing than a dramatic conclusion.
Right.
Um, but it's a story that can't be resolved because it's about the good in evil and the evil in good. It's the yin and the yang.
Mhm.
So where does that end but infinity?
Mhm.
There will never be absolute good or absolute evil. So Willard is not going to see the light, and uh, Kurtz is not going to see the light. It's just going to cycle. And that's not a satisfying ending.
No.
No, no.
That's not the Star Wars endings that are much more satisfying.
Much more satisfying. Blow up the Death Star. Yeah, that's no. Film students out there, don't end on philosophy. No, no.
Okay, now you raised something that I wasn't thinking about before. Don't end on philosophy, because there's a movie, The Devil's Advocate, which is based on a Schlock novel. It's got Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino. And Al Pacino plays Satan. And the movie ends on philosophy. That is, that the devil will get you if you're vain about being good or vain about being bad. It doesn't matter as long as you're vain. Never seen a movie end like that, especially that kind of movie. And I knew right away that the writers had spent 2 years at a big New York law firm,
Yeah.
and then knew exactly what they wanted to say.
Yeah, film is not about ideas.
Mhm.
It's really not. I mean, filmmakers try to do that, Francis is one of them, and I think his less successful efforts are about ideas. Godard tried to make films about ideas. Films are about emotions, and insofar as an emotion brings you to a new understanding, film can be about ideas, but you don't get there through the brain. You get there through moving pictures, and um, uh, the good ones are the ones that have heart. A page can convey more subtlety of meaning than an image, I think,
Mhm.
but not the same emotion.
It's interesting if you talk about the arc of civilization along that line. I mean, the printed press and the words, and then everyone's excited about ideas and stuff like that. But it seems like everybody's very comfortable being back to imagery again. And that now that we have television and the digital thing, that people have always thought in images. Only a small portion of the population thinks conceptually and abstractly. And so it's not at all surprising. Not only do we get to images, but we got to cartoons. And,
Yes.
and then we have movies about superheroes that are pretty much like cartoons instead of like people.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up. I'm a fan of images. I mean, I'm a movie person. I'm also a fan of words. I'm a writer. But there are good images and there are bad images. There are powerful, poetic images. We can think now, what comes to mind of the great movies are the great images that'll stay with us forever.
Mhm.
Um, we'll never forget them. There are great images, but there are also fast food images.
Mhm.
And the movies that you're talking about have served us fast food images.
Mhm.
And we are raising or have raised a generation of film goers who don't know the difference.
Mhm.
And so in my utopian fantasy, film is something that is taught around the world at the high school level, the way that we teach English. You
Mhm.
know, we hopefully come out of high school with some sense of sentences having value. There's a good sentence and there's a bad sentence. There's good grammar, there's incorrect grammar. Um, if we graduated high school with the same knowledge in with imagery,
Mhm.
uh, we could have a better, smarter audience that would demand more from our filmmakers.
We would. We would.
We would.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
agree with that. So one of the things about being emotionally honest that had to do with Apocalypse is Eleanor and Francis exposing their relationship and everything to the world. I mean, it wasn't so intentional, but then was cooperated by both parties, and then not cooperated, et cetera, et cetera. It's a fascinating story, and I know that the movie One from the Heart seems to be an emotional story,
Mhm.
not quite just an apology to Eleanor, but kind of an apology, and an expensive one.
Mhm.
Um, so why don't you talk about that? Because it's amazing. I just watched it last night. I'd never watched it before, and I was really impressed with the imagery
Yep.
but the simple what he wanted to say was pretty straightforward.
Yep.
And therefore I can understand why it didn't do as well. But I don't think I've ever seen, for example, a series of titles that were done more cleverly.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Absolutely beautifully done, and it was especially with the Las Vegas background idea. So they used the images and everything, but I just loved the way they did that. It was very cool.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, One from the Heart is a movie that I can excuse someone for not liking, but if somebody does have affection for it, I'm always glad to hear it, because while the movie doesn't work,
Mhm.
I would say,
Yeah.
there is so much care in the filmmaking. That's where the real heart is. But to go to your question about the Eleanor and the autobiographical aspect, yes, Francis and Eleanor's marriage was hit bottom
Mhm.
in the jungle. It's what happens when you go crazy. Um,
You're not at your best,
and
no.
you're not at your best. And part of Francis's recovery was wanting to make a love story, and wanting to do it in the safe environment of a studio, where he could control all of the elements, um, and fall in love again with the good things in life. Because that's what craziness is when you lose touch with the good things in life,
Mhm.
you go crazy. And Francis wanted to heal and love and separate. He had been unfaithful to Eleanor, and that's what One from the Heart is about.
Mhm.
Um, what is fantasy love versus what is real love?
Mhm.
And that's something that Francis tries to reckon with in that movie. And it's a challenge for a lot of creative people who are so naturally in their imaginative minds. You know, they can go the Gatsby way of seeing in Daisy something that isn't there. And unsurprisingly, Francis wrote the script to Great Gatsby, which was filmed.
Mhm.
Um, so it was a way to try to heal himself
Mhm.
and heal his marriage. Um,
The Great Gatsby he did is the earlier one with Mia Farrow, right? And
right,
yeah,
right, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, it's fascinating because just and they did it. Eleanor was doing a documentary of them making the movie Apocalypse, and eventually allowed that to go out in her diaries, to go out. And I thought it was fascinating that they survived that amount of exposure and honesty.
You believe it?
No, very hard to
And
believe.
I mean, it's anyone who hasn't seen the documentary Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse, must go out and see it. It covers the making of Apocalypse Now, and much of the footage was shot. Much of the footage was shot by Eleanor. All the interviews, and you see the lengths to which a man will go to realize his dream. It's a version of the story that Werner Herzog made when he made Fitzcarraldo. Herzog and Francis were friends, so I do suspect that there's a lot of Francis in that story. But yeah, Francis invited Eleanor to make a documentary about him making Apocalypse because he knew that he needed to have promotional material. The studio wanted him to have making of footage of Apocalypse. And Francis wanted somebody close to him making the movie because he didn't want to open the set to someone he didn't know. He wanted to keep it close. So there was his wife, and she's a photographer and an artist and wanted something to do. It was perfect. Why not have Eleanor shoot this promotional, electronic press kit? Well, he didn't know that she was going to be filming the destruction of his sanity and their marriage and their family.
Right.
I
assume she didn't know either, right?
No.
I thought it was interesting in One from the Heart how Natasha Kinski plays Circus Girl. And it's this, just the name Circus Girl as the fantasy, and that she disappears, and she disappears in the film when he's done. I thought that was good imagery.
It's good imagery, yeah.
As you say, it tells the story,
It sure does. And that movie is full of beautiful images.
Yeah, just the way it looked like a set at times, like a stage set where you could see both conversations, both infidelities taking place at the same time, behind different screens. And
isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, that was really, really well done.
Yeah, really beautiful. And no, theater. Francis wanted to create a theatrical environment to making that movie, because for him, the theater is a community. In a way, film is not often a community. People making a play are thrown in together with an intimacy that you don't have in film. In part because there are so many impediments to the work, and it's so slow, and people aren't. It's not claustrophobic the same way that the theater is. Which you
is that a compliment to the theater, or is it?
Well, yes. I should say it's not intimate. I should say it's not as intimate as making theater.
Right.
And Francis wants film to be intimate for the filmmakers.
So before we go to Megalopolis, I would like to just have you mention a little bit how many famous directors and other who had aged out, whatever, that he brought back, how he got his father, he arranged for his father to have his dream, get an Oscar. I mean, father, I'm sure, didn't think he's ever going to get that. That part of your story is very interesting, how big a family he considered his family and how he tried to make things happen for all kinds of other people, including the other directors who usually you'd be competing with. Other great directors.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, it's one of Francis's great legacies as the producer, and a producer of enormous integrity. Kurosawa, for instance, when Kurosawa couldn't get the financing for a movie whose name I can never pronounce, Kagemusha, I think. What Francis did for Paul Schrader, what he did for Lucas, we know. Carol Ballard, truly endless. Eleanor, we just told that story. Wim Wenders, Caleb Deschanel.
His daughter.
I was just gonna say, we were thinking the same. His daughter. Yeah, and this is also the Francis a Utopian, you know? Come make a movie with Zoetrope. You have a good idea, come make a movie. In the early days of Zoetrope in San Francisco, he would have office hours. And people off the street would come in. Hey, I got a movie. I got a movie idea. I mean, can you imagine that happening today in the studios, to just have an hour where you can listen to these fresh ideas? It's such a great thought, and nobody does it.
Yeah.
If your job was the buying and selling of stories, wouldn't you want to hear the story of somebody who was so burning to tell it to you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Francis did that. But yes, that's part of the same spirit as endorsing all of these filmmakers, young and old, at Zoetrope Studios on the payroll. He had Gene Kelly, Michael Powell, Godard, David Lynch.
I thought that was fascinating. Was surprised about that one.
Yeah, David Lynch, Martha Coolidge, who would then go off and make Valley Girl with Nicolas Cage, who she met at Zoetrope.
Not everyone knows Nicolas Cage. You mentioned earlier, but Nicolas Cage is the son of his older brother, right? Of Francis, older brother.
Nicolas Cage is Francis's nephew.
Right.
Yeah.
Talented family. And in addition to talented, obviously he uses network and his extended family to try to support everybody. That's what it sure seems like. And as you said, both older and younger.
Yeah, and he, this Hollywood's really a business about finding talent before anyone else has, because it gets expensive when someone's found it, right? It's like the stock market. You want to invest when the stocks are low,
right? And
Francis knows how to do that, and that requires sometimes taking a risk. And he did it with me. He had no reason. He had some reason to trust me, and that was the work that I've done. But that doesn't mean I'm was gonna write a book that would ultimately be flattering, which I hope it is. But he took a chance on me.
Well, let's talk about his life's work that's wrapped up in Megalopolis, a movie that, although it's now been shown a couple of times, it's not really released yet, so it's hard to find yet. And it's supposed to come out. And I want to draw an analogy here. He's 85 years old, right now, or something like that. 85.
86 maybe. Yeah, as one of those.
So he's finished this movie, having thought about it and everything for 40-some years. So from the time he's in his 40s to the time he's in his early 80s, he finished it. And there's a large number of reviews that talk about the imagery and everything like that. But is this going to be a movie that will sell? And he's over $100 million of his own money, so we know all that. So the analogy or the attention I want to draw to is, we have politicians that are at the same age, that we're all going, do we really want to give them, I'm not going to point out either one, they're both qualified for this analysis. Are we really going to let them be in charge again at this age? Well, obviously, no one let him be in charge again at his age. He used his own money to do it himself. But did he create something earth-shattering? You haven't seen it yet either, right? So did he create something earth-shattering that really finally culminated in what he wanted? Or did he make another very elaborate and very expensive personal statement, sort of like one from the heart, that is his way of saying what he wants the future to be?
Or does it matter?
Or does it matter?
or does it matter? Um, 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 do we want to see what could be the final work of one of our great filmmakers? And not just the final work, but the lifetime's work,
Hmm.
the magnum opus. Good or bad, we know it is going to be magnum.
Hmm.
And yes, we should see it. Also because of what it's about. And it is about utopia. It is about making the world better. And I've hinted at this throughout our conversation that this is something that's important for Francis. But he studied it his whole life. He studied the utopian idea his whole life, and not just studied it, he's lived it. And this, I think, is the most important point of Francis and whatever I have to say on the subject. And that is that filmmaking, because of the size of film of what filmmaking requires, the sheer number of people it takes to make a movie, the fact of the interdisciplinary diversity that is required of filmmaking talent. You need writers, directors, politicians, technicians, designers, almost any kind of talent um, has a part on a film. Where I'm going with this is that you have a test case for a community when you make a movie. You have different kinds of people working creatively, working together. Now, if that isn't a rehearsal for utopia,
Hmm.
I don't know what is. And that's the way Francis has worked his whole life. So that's a long roundabout way of saying that Francis has walked the walk.
Hmm.
He hasn't just been in his ivory tower thinking about these issues. Zoetrope is the way that he has experimented, sometimes failed, sometimes succeeded, with the question of how do we live together creatively. And creative doesn't just have to mean aesthetically. Wherever there is talent, there is creativity. And movies allow film production allows for all of those talents to coexist. So I hope I'm not overly verbose. I probably am.
No, that was great.
That is what is going into Megalopolis.
It's interesting because in his way, a lot of utopias put a lot of emphasis on obedience to the authority. And he's like just the opposite. How are we going to all be creative individuals and still come out without ruining everything, in a way?
Exactly.
And that's very, it takes a different vision and a different way of looking at things. So
it's a great question. It's the question.
Yeah. We haven't gotten the answer to that one yet.
No, we haven't. But we haven't. And Francis has tried and failed for that very reason, because he doesn't want to be a dictator.
Right.
And that's created a lot of chaos. But an experiment doesn't have to succeed in order for it to be a success.
Right.
It has to be a teaching tool. And I think utopia means the place from nowhere.
Right.
And Francis believes that utopia will not succeed. It is a fantasy, but we need to have the fantasy, keep engaging with the fantasy in order to get as close as we're going to get to the reality.
When you're doing the description of Megalopolis, of all the different talent, I thought of one of the things that you emphasized in your book, which was Murch and his sound effects. Do I have the right?
Yeah.
The sound effects and what he brought new to film, which is now common, but that he really brought a different approach to audio, to film, which makes a big difference in telling the stories. Obviously, I'm not talking about the background music. There's all the other audio effects, which people use in all kinds of music now. There's all kinds of audio effects that are being done, not just musical sounds while they're doing it for different.
Yeah, Murch was trying to think less literally about sound effects. You see it's not true of all movies, but if you look at most of the movies of the golden age, it's you see a gun shot, you hear a gunshot. It's literal. And Murch exploded that idea. It's a more a painterly idea about sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, we have a lot of actual questions from the live stream audience that want to ask, and we like to get them involved whenever we can. So there's quite a few here. One question is, Tetro is a great film. What happened to it at the box office?
People disagree with you, is what happened. I'm glad you like Tetro. I struggle with it, but it certainly is beautiful, and it really is personal. And that's very much Francis telling the story of him and his older brother.
Mm-hmm.
It might be the most explicitly autobiographical film that he's made.
All right. Can you talk about the first Coppola movie that you saw, or the one that resonated with you the most?
The first one I saw was Apocalypse Now.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw it in the theater. And it's very important that we see these movies in the theater. I mean, it's very important that we see great movies in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
If it's crap, I don't care how you watch it. It's crap. It's leftovers. It doesn't have to be warm. Just eat it. But if you're going to have a filet mignon, I want you to have a chef, and eat it in a delicious restaurant. And that's when I saw Apocalypse, and I knew I was getting a sensory experience in 3-dimension, extreme movie making. And I knew nothing at that point about how the film was made. All I got was that I was being rocked by sound and imagery, in a way that only a movie could. Who made this thing?
Speaking of sound and imagery, I have headphones for listening to the movie. So One from the Heart starts with a roulette ball going around the thing, and you're sitting there, and it's going around your head. And I assume that the same thing is done in the theaters. And I thought, no, it's pretty darn clever. And I had already read your book about.
Well, one of the other innovations of Murch was a sound, a surround, using the surround sound in that way.
Another question. During your research for this book, was there anything that you learned that either surprised or shocked you?
Oh, loads. Loads. I mean, I was surprised by how Francis was committed to this utopian idea, that it was not a sideline, that Francis, I would say, is a community builder first and a director second. Mm-hmm. That surprised me, that I was writing a book about a leader, not who just happened to make movies.
And great ones.
And great ones, yeah.
It just happened to be. So here's a non-Coppola question. What is one movie that you recommend we see this summer?
A new movie?
Yeah, a new movie. Is there any movie on the horizon that you've heard about or whatever that you think is, or you've just seen that you think, oh, everybody should go see that? That's a no if I see your head moving in that direction.
I must say, I've been so disheartened over the years. Mm-hmm. I don't really follow it anymore. Mm-hmm. I'll still go to the theater because I love going to the movies, but much more circumspect. I go to the theater to see mostly older movies. I wish I could say I'm
We'll
excited.
we'll have someone in their early 20s answer that question next time.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I did go see Furiosa,
Uh-huh.
the George Miller movie, which is unbelievable on a pure craft level. I mean, this guy was born to speak movies. Whether it amounts to anything, I don't think so. But George Miller is a master, and it is a worthwhile cinematic experience that should be enjoyed in the theater.
Right. Good example. All right. Well, that's all of our time. I'd like to mention again that this is your book was chosen to be part of our Great Lit series, which is funded by the Bernard Osher Foundation, and that was extremely pleasant, Sam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. I wish I could stay and keep talking. I had so much fun. Please have me back for anything.
Yeah, well, it was really great, and there's lots more stories like that in the book besides the ones that we talked about. Thanks a lot for coming to the Commonwealth Club, even if you just, where did you come to us from?
I'm here in LA.
In LA, okay. Not even that far
Laurel
away.
Canyon.
Great. Well, we'll see you again for your next book.
Thank you, George. I love that. Frank Capra.
We got to do Frank Capra. Absolutely.
Frank Capra.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sam.
All right.
And so at another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 121st year of enlightened discussion. We hope you enjoyed that. I'm sure you did. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.